They called him Mush Morton, and he was about to turn the Pacific War upside down with a submarine, a gutsy crew, and tactics so aggressive that even his own commanders thought he'd lost his mind. This is the story of the USS Wahoo, the submarine that didn't just hunt the enemy. It hunted them with such ferocity that Japan learned to fear the sound of her approach. What happened beneath those dark Pacific waters would change naval warfare forever. The year was 1942, and the United States Navy was losing the Pacific War. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, American submariners were frustrated, demoralized, and watching their torpedoes bounce harmlessly off enemy hulls or explode prematurely. The submarine service, which should have been strangling Japan's vital supply lines, was instead becoming known for failed patrols and wasted opportunities. Captains followed cautious tactics, attacking only when conditions were perfect, often letting targets slip away into the night. The brass in Pearl Harbor knew something had to change, but they didn't know what. That's when Lieutenant Commander Dudley Mush Morton took command of the USS Wahoo. Morton was different from other submarine commanders. Where they saw caution, he saw opportunity. Where they retreated, he attacked. Born in Kentucky in 1907, Morton had graduated from the Naval Academy with a reputation for being unconventional, even reckless. His nickname, Mush, came from the Kentucky mush he claimed his mother fed him, but there was nothing soft about his approach to warfare. When he assumed command of Wahoo in December 1942, he brought with him a radical philosophy. Submarines shouldn't hide from the enemy, they should hunt them down like wolves. The Wahoo herself was a Gado-class submarine, 311 feet of steel armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a crew of 80 men. She'd been commissioned just a year earlier in May 1942, but her first patrols under previous commanders had been unremarkable. She was just another submarine in a fleet that wasn't performing. But Morton saw something more. He saw a weapon that could strike terror into the heart of the Japanese Empire if only someone had the courage to use it properly. Morton's first innovation was to reorganize how his submarine operated. Traditional submarine doctrine put the captain at the periscope, trying to simultaneously navigate the boat, track targets, and command the attack. Morton realized this was inefficient. Instead, he gave the periscope duties to his executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, who would become one of the most decorated submariners in history. O'Kane would call out bearings and ranges while Morton stood back, visualizing the entire tactical situation, making command decisions without being glued to the eyepiece. This partnership between Morton and O'Kane would become legendary, a perfectly synchronized team that could process information and execute attacks faster than any other submarine crew in the Pacific. But tactics were only part of the revolution. Morton changed the culture aboard Wahoo. He demanded aggression from every man, fostered an almost reckless confidence, and made it clear that Wahoo was going hunting, not hiding. He conducted drills constantly, pushing his crew until they could dive the boat in under a minute, fire torpedoes with deadly accuracy, and surface to chase targets with their deck gun. The crew responded to Morton's leadership with fierce loyalty. They believed in him, believed in the boat, and believed they were going to win this war one sinking at a time. Wahoo's third war patrol, beginning in January 1943, would prove Morton's methods and establish his submarine as the most feared predator in the Pacific. Morton took Wahoo north, into the frigid waters off New Guinea, deliberately choosing hunting grounds that other captains avoided as too dangerous. The Japanese controlled these waters, and enemy aircraft patrolled constantly. Morton didn't care. He wanted targets, and targets meant going where the enemy felt safe.
On January 24, 1943, Wahoo encountered a Japanese convoy near Wewak Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea. What happened next violated every rule in the submarine warfare manual. Instead of firing from long range and fleeing, Morton took Wahoo directly into the harbor itself, penetrating the enemy's defensive perimeter in broad daylight. O'Kane, at the periscope, identified multiple targets: a destroyer, several freighters, and transport ships packed with troops. Morton calmly ordered the boat deeper into the harbor, maneuvering for the perfect shot. The attack was devastating. Wahoo's torpedoes slammed into the destroyer Harasame, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom in minutes. Morton didn't retreat. Instead, he swung Wahoo around for another attack, torpedoing a transport ship that erupted in flames. The harbor exploded into chaos. Japanese patrol boats scrambled to find the submarine, dropping depth charges that shook Wahoo's hull, but Morton kept pressing the attack. He surfaced briefly to finish off damaged ships with his deck gun, the crew manning the weapon while enemy bullets pinged off the conning tower. O'Kane, at the periscope, identified multiple targets: a destroyer, several freighters, and transport ships packed with troops. Morton calmly ordered the boat deeper into the harbor, maneuvering for the perfect shot. The attack was devastating. Wahoo's torpedoes slammed into the destroyer Harasame, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom in minutes. Morton didn't retreat. Instead, he swung Wahoo around for another attack, torpedoing a transport ship that erupted in flames. The harbor exploded into chaos. Japanese patrol boats scrambled to find the submarine, dropping depth charges that shook Wahoo's hull, but Morton kept pressing the attack. He surfaced briefly to finish off damaged ships with his deck gun, the crew manning the weapon while enemy bullets pinged off the conning tower. O'Kane, at the periscope, identified multiple targets: a destroyer, several freighters, and transport ships packed with troops. Morton calmly ordered the boat deeper into the harbor, maneuvering for the perfect shot. The patrol continued with more attacks, more sinkings, more impossible risks that somehow paid off. Wahoo sank a troop ship carrying Japanese soldiers, then controversially surfaced to machine gun survivors in the water, an action that remains debated by historians, but which Morton justified as military necessity, claiming the soldiers would simply regroup and return to fight American troops on New Guinea. The incident reflected the brutal, total nature of the Pacific War, where mercy was a luxury few could afford. When Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor on February 7, 1943, she was flying a battle flag that stunned everyone who saw it. Morton claimed 9 ships sunk, over 30,000 tons sent to the bottom. While post-war analysis would revise these numbers downward, as was common with wartime claims, the psychological impact was undeniable. Morton and Wahoo had demonstrated that aggressive submarine warfare worked. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, immediately recognized that Morton had cracked the code. Here was the model for how submarines should fight. The Navy promoted Morton's example throughout the submarine service. His patrol reports were distributed and studied. Other commanders began adopting his tactics: close-range attacks, penetrating enemy harbors, using speed and surprise instead of caution. The timid approach that had characterized early war patrols gave way to aggressive hunting. Morton himself became a hero in the press back home. His exploits featured in newsreels and magazines. America needed victories, needed heroes, and Mush Morton and the Wahoo provided both. Wahoo's 4th Patrol targeted the Yellow Sea, waters between Japan, Korea, and China that were considered the enemy's backyard. Morton took his boat through minefields and past patrol vessels to reach the most heavily trafficked Japanese shipping lanes. The hunting was spectacular. Wahoo attacked convoys repeatedly, sometimes on the surface in running gun battles, sometimes submerged in textbook torpedo attacks. Morton's aggression reached its peak when he chased a Japanese freighter for hours, finally catching it and sinking it with gunfire. The patrol added more victories to Wahoo's tally, further cementing her reputation as the deadliest submarine in the Pacific. Life aboard Wahoo during these patrols was intense. The crew lived in cramped quarters, breathing recycled air heavy with diesel fumes and body odor. They slept in shifts, hot bunking when space was limited, and endured weeks without fresh food, sunlight, or any contact with the outside world except radio messages from Pearl Harbor. But Morton's leadership made the hardship bearable. He treated his crew as equals, ate the same food, endured the same conditions, and made sure every man knew his contribution mattered. He would walk through the boat talking with sailors, learning their names, asking about their families. This democratic approach was unusual for naval officers of that era, but it forged an unbreakable bond between commander and crew.
The technical challenges were immense. Submarine warfare in 1943 required solving complex mathematical problems in seconds while under enemy attack. Calculating firing solutions meant accounting for the target's speed, course, and distance, while simultaneously considering Wahoo's own movement, the torpedo's running characteristics, and the curvature of the torpedo's path through the water. O'Kane and Morton developed an almost telepathic ability to work these problems together. O'Kane would call observations from the periscope, while Morton visualized the geometry in his head, ordering course changes and firing commands that seemed to come from pure instinct, but were actually the product of countless drills and natural tactical genius. The torpedoes themselves were a constant source of frustration. Early in the war, American torpedoes were plagued with defects: magnetic exploders that detonated prematurely, depth-keeping mechanisms that caused torpedoes to run too deep, and contact exploders that failed to detonate on impact. Submariners watched in anguish as their torpedoes hit enemy ships squarely and failed to explode. Morton dealt with these problems by ordering contact hits only, closing to point-blank range where even a malfunctioning torpedo couldn't miss. He also demanded his torpedomen maintain their weapons meticulously, checking and rechecking every mechanism. These measures helped, but torpedo reliability remained a problem throughout 1943. Wahoo's 5th Patrol in March 1943 took her back to the Yellow Sea. Morton was now operating with complete confidence, taking risks that would have terrified other commanders. He attacked a convoy of 5 ships, sinking 3 and damaging the others. Japanese destroyers counterattacked, dropping patterns of depth charges that exploded around Wahoo like underwater thunder. The submarine dove deep, her hull creaking under the pressure, lights flickering, men holding their breath as each explosion walked closer. Morton remained calm, ordering silent running and outsmarting the Japanese by doubling back through his own wake. The destroyers lost contact, and Wahoo escaped to hunt again. The crew's confidence bordered on invincibility. They'd survived so many close calls, sunk so many ships, that they began to believe Wahoo was blessed, unstoppable. Morton encouraged this attitude. Before each patrol, he would gather the crew and promise them that they were going to make history, that Wahoo was going to sink more tonnage than any other boat in the fleet. And patrol after patrol, he delivered on those promises. By mid-1943, the Japanese Navy knew about Wahoo. Intelligence reports identified her as a particularly dangerous threat, and orders went out to anti-submarine forces to hunt for the aggressive American submarine operating in their waters. But knowing about Wahoo and catching her proved to be different things. Morton's unpredictability made him nearly impossible to entrap. He would strike in one area, then appear hundreds of miles away before the enemy could respond. He used weather, darkness, and the vast empty spaces of the Pacific to his advantage, appearing seemingly out of nowhere to devastate a convoy, then vanishing before Japanese forces could concentrate against him. The strain of constant combat was taking its toll, however. By Wahoo's 6th patrol, some crew members were showing signs of battle fatigue. The human mind can only endure so much stress, so many near-death experiences before it begins to crack. Morton recognized this and requested that some of his most exhausted crew members be rotated to shore duty. But the core team, Morton, O'Kane, and the veteran sailors who'd been with Wahoo from the beginning, remained, unwilling to leave the boat that had become their home and their weapon.
In the summer of 1943, after 6 successful patrols, O'Kane was promoted and given his own command. It was a bittersweet moment. The Morton-O'Kane partnership had been the heart of Wahoo's success, and breaking it up seemed like tempting fate. O'Kane would go on to command USS Tang and become the most successful submarine commander in U.S. Navy history. But he always credited Morton with teaching him everything he knew about aggressive submarine warfare. Morton received a new executive officer, but the chemistry was never quite the same.
Wahoo's 7th patrol in August 1943 was successful, but less spectacular than previous patrols. Morton sank several ships, but seemed to be missing his perfect partner. Still, he returned safely and began planning for his 8th patrol. Naval intelligence had identified a target-rich area, the Sea of Japan itself, the body of water surrounded by the Japanese home islands. No American submarine had successfully penetrated the Sea of Japan and returned. The entrances were narrow, heavily mined, and patrolled constantly. It was, effectively, enemy territory in the most literal sense. Morton volunteered Wahoo for the mission. It was exactly the kind of challenge he craved, penetrating the enemy's innermost sanctum and proving that nowhere was safe from American submarines. In early October 1943, Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor for her 8th war patrol. Morton's orders were to transit north through La Perouse Strait, the narrow passage between Sakhalin Island and Hokkaido, enter the Sea of Japan, wreak havoc on shipping, and exit through the same strait. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps too ambitious. The last confirmed sighting of Wahoo was on October 5, 1943, when she reported entering the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait. She transmitted a message stating she was heading for the hunting grounds and expected to find plenty of targets. Morton sounded confident, upbeat, ready for another successful patrol. Then, silence. Days passed. Wahoo essed her scheduled radio contacts. Weeks went by with no word. By November, Wahoo was officially listed as missing and presumed lost. All 80 crew members, including Mush Morton, were declared dead. The mystery of what happened to Wahoo would not be solved for decades. Japanese records captured after the war provided clues but no definitive answer. In 2006, a team of underwater explorers using side-scan sonar finally located Wahoo's wreck in La Perouse Strait, lying in 200 feet of water. The evidence suggested that Wahoo had been caught on the surface or at periscope depth by Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943, while attempting to exit the Sea of Japan after a successful patrol. A Japanese aircraft dropped bombs that damaged the submarine, forcing her to the surface where patrol boats finished her off with depth charges and gunfire. Wahoo went down with all hands, her final patrol completed, but her escape denied. The loss of Wahoo and Mush Morton sent shockwaves through the submarine service. Morton had seemed invincible, and Wahoo had appeared unstoppable. Their loss reminded everyone that submarine warfare, no matter how skillfully conducted, was inherently dangerous. The sea and the enemy could claim even the best boats and the bravest crews. But Morton's legacy lived on. The aggressive tactics he pioneered became standard practice in the submarine force. Commanders who'd once been cautious adopted his methods. Close-range attacks, harbor penetrations, surface gun battles, and relentless pursuit of targets. The transformation of the Pacific submarine force from timid to aggressive can be directly traced to Morton's example. Statistics tell part of the story. During her 7 completed war patrols, Wahoo was credited with sinking 10 ships totaling over 60,000 tons. Post-war analysis revised these numbers to approximately 10 confirmed sinkings, but the impact went beyond tonnage. Wahoo proved that submarines could dominate the war at sea, that American submariners could outfight the Japanese Navy, and that aggressive leadership made all the difference. The submarine force adopted Morton's tactics fleet-wide, and by 1944,
American submarines were strangling Japan's economy, sinking tankers faster than they could be replaced, cutting off raw materials, food, and fuel from the home islands. In the end, the USS Wahoo changed the war not through any single action, but through demonstrating what was possible when courage, skill, and aggressive tactics combined. Mush Morton showed that the submarine wasn't just a weapon of stealth, but a weapon of terror, that boldness could overcome superior enemy numbers, and that leadership mattered more than technology. His legacy influenced an entire generation of submarine commanders who went on to win the Pacific War beneath the waves. The submarine force that helped bring Japan to its knees in 1945 was built on the foundation Morton laid during those incredible patrols in 1943.
Today, Wahoo rests in the cold waters of Lapérouse Strait, a war grave for 80 brave men who gave everything for their country. Mush Morton was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, though many believe he deserved the Medal of Honor. His tactics are still studied at the Naval Submarine School. His name is spoken with reverence by submariners who understand what he accomplished. And somewhere in those dark Pacific depths, the USS Wahoo remains on eternal patrol, a testament to the courage of men who hunted the enemy without fear and changed the course of history, one torpedo at a time. The story of USS Wahoo and Mush Morton represents more than just one submarine's war record. It embodies a fundamental shift in how America fought the Pacific War. To truly understand Wahoo's impact, we must examine the broader context of submarine warfare in World War II and how Morton's revolution rippled through the entire United States Navy. When war erupted at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the U.S. submarine force was woefully unprepared for the conflict ahead. American naval doctrine had focused primarily on battleships and aircraft carriers, viewing submarines as auxiliary vessels useful for reconnaissance and coastal defense, but not as primary offensive weapons. The Germans had demonstrated the devastating potential of submarine warfare in the Atlantic with their U-boat wolf packs, but American naval planners had been slow to adapt similar aggressive tactics for the Pacific theater. The vastness of the Pacific Ocean, the scattered nature of Japanese shipping routes, and conservative command philosophy all contributed to a cautious, defensive mindset among early American submarine commanders. The submarine crews themselves were among the most highly trained sailors in the Navy. Every man aboard a submarine had to be a volunteer. No one was forced into submarine duty. The training was rigorous and the washout rate was high. Submariners had to master not just their specific job, but understand every system on the boat. A torpedoman needed to know how to operate the diesel engines. An electrician had to understand the torpedo firing systems. This cross-training was essential because damage in combat might require anyone to perform any job. The men who served aboard submarines were intelligent, motivated, and brave, but in the early months of the war, they were being held back by timid leadership and faulty equipment. The torpedo crisis of 1942 and early 1943 cannot be overstated. American submariners were going into combat with weapons that simply didn't work. The Mark 14 torpedo, the standard weapon for American submarines, suffered from multiple critical flaws. Its magnetic influence exploder was supposed to detonate beneath the ship's keel, breaking its back, but instead it would often explode prematurely as soon as it sensed any magnetic field. The torpedo's depth-keeping mechanism was miscalibrated, causing torpedoes set to run at 10 feet to actually run at 25 feet, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Even when torpedoes hit their targets squarely, the contact exploder was so poorly designed that it would often fail to detonate on impact, especially if the torpedoes struck at the perpendicular angle that was supposed to be ideal. Submariners reported these problems repeatedly, but the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington refused to believe their own weapons were defective. They blamed submarine commanders for poor shooting, accused crews of making excuses for missed targets, and insisted the torpedoes were perfect. This institutional arrogance cost American lives and wasted opportunities throughout 1942. It took commanders like Morton, who documented torpedo failures meticulously and demanded accountability, to finally force the Bureau of Ordnance to conduct proper tests. When they did, they discovered their torpedoes were indeed fundamentally flawed.
Fixes were gradually implemented throughout 1943, but early in the war, submariners were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Morton's genius was partly in how he adapted to these limitations. He couldn't fix the torpedoes himself, but he could minimize their defects by firing from extremely close range, using straight bow shots that reduced the chance of exploders failing, and following up with deck gun attacks when torpedoes malfunctioned. His aggressive tactics actually compensated for the technical deficiencies of his weapons. Other commanders, firing from safer distances, saw their torpedoes fail more often because they were giving the faulty mechanisms more opportunities to malfunction. Morton's point-blank attacks gave the torpedoes less time and distance to go wrong.
The transformation that Morton brought to Wahoo was psychological as much as tactical. Submarine duty was inherently terrifying. Crews lived inside a steel tube that could become a tomb in seconds if something went wrong. One leak, one miscalculation, one enemy depth charge in the right place, and everyone died, crushed by water pressure, drowned, or suffocated. The ocean itself was the enemy as much as the Japanese. Submariners dealt with this fear in different ways, but Morton's approach was to replace fear with aggression. He convinced his crew that the best defense was a ferocious offense, that attacking constantly kept the enemy off balance and actually increased their chances of survival. Whether this was objectively true is debatable, but psychologically it worked. The Wahoo crew believed they were hunters rather than prey, and that belief made them more effective. Morton's relationship with his crew was unusual for the hierarchical, class-conscious Navy of the 1940s. Naval officers typically maintained strict social distance from enlisted men. Officers ate separately, slept in private quarters, and socialized only with other officers. Morton broke down these barriers aboard Wahoo. He would sit in the crew's mess and eat with enlisted sailors. He learned personal details about their lives and families. He solicited opinions from junior enlisted men about tactics and operations. This democratic leadership style created intense loyalty. The crew didn't just follow Morton's orders, they would have followed him into hell itself. Several crew members wrote letters home describing Morton as the best commanding officer in the Navy, a man they trusted completely with their lives. This trust was tested repeatedly during combat. Depth charge attacks were psychological torture. The submarine would dive deep, shut down all non-essential systems to reduce noise, and sit silently in the dark while enemy destroyers hunted overhead. The crew could hear the destroyer's propellers through the hull, a distinctive thudding sound that grew louder as the enemy approached. Then would come the splashes as depth charges hit the water, followed by horrifying explosions that shook the entire boat. Light bulbs shattered, gauges cracked, men were thrown against bulkheads. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead. The hull itself would groan and creak under the pressure of the deep water and the concussions of the explosions. Some men would pray. Others would sit frozen, eyes wide with terror, and Morton would stand calmly in the control room, speaking in a normal conversational voice, occasionally making a dry joke, radiating an almost supernatural calm that steadied everyone around him. The technical skill required to escape depth charge attacks was immense. The submarine commander had to think in 3 dimensions, constantly calculating the enemy's position based on sound contacts, predicting where the next pattern of depth charges would fall, and maneuvering the submarine to avoid them, while staying deep enough to avoid detection, but not so deep that water pressure would crush the hull. Morton excelled at this deadly game. He would order the boat to stop all engines and drift silently, letting the enemy pass overhead. Or he would creep away at minimal speed, moving perpendicular to the enemy's search pattern. Sometimes he would double back through his own wake, confusing the enemy's sonar. Each technique required perfect timing and iron nerves. The crew members who served with Morton and survived the war, those who'd been rotated off Wahoo before her final patrol, never forgot their time aboard that submarine. They spoke of Morton with an almost religious reverence. Roger Payne, one of Wahoo's officers, later wrote that serving under Morton was the defining experience of his life.
that he'd never felt more alive or more purposeful than during those patrols. George Grider, another officer, described Morton as the bravest man I ever knew, and said that Morton had taught him what leadership really meant. These weren't casual compliments from men caught up in wartime enthusiasm. They were considered judgments from combat veterans who'd had decades to reflect on their experiences. The psychological profile of successful submarine commanders fascinated naval psychologists during and after the war. What made men like Morton effective? Studies found that the best submarine commanders shared certain traits. High intelligence, obviously, but also emotional stability under extreme stress, the ability to make quick decisions with incomplete information, natural aggression tempered by tactical judgment, and charisma that inspired loyalty. Morton possessed all these qualities in abundance. He was smart enough to innovate tactically, stable enough to remain calm during depth charge attacks, aggressive enough to press home attacks when others would have retreated, wise enough to know when to break off an engagement, and charismatic enough to make his crew believe in him absolutely. The impact of Wahoo's success spread through the submarine force in multiple ways. Most directly, Morton's patrol reports were circulated among other submarine commanders and studied carefully. These reports were remarkably detailed, describing not just what happened, but why Morton made specific tactical decisions. He explained his reasoning, shared lessons learned, and offered suggestions for other commanders. The submarine force had never seen patrol reports like this. They were essentially tactical textbooks written in real-time combat. Admiral Lockwood made sure these reports reached every submarine commander in the Pacific, effectively using Morton as an instructor for the entire fleet.
Lockwood himself deserves credit for recognizing Morton's genius and promoting his methods. Many admirals would have been threatened by a subordinate who violated established doctrine and took enormous risks. Lockwood instead saw that Morton had discovered something revolutionary and had the wisdom to support him, protect him from more conservative critics, and spread his innovations throughout the force. This combination, Morton's tactical brilliance and Lockwood's institutional support, transformed American submarine warfare. The ripple effects extended beyond tactics to submarine design and equipment. Morton's experiences identified specific needs that influenced future submarine classes. He demonstrated the value of high surface speed for pursuing targets, leading to emphasis on more powerful diesel engines. His surface gun battles proved that submarines needed better deck armament, resulting in improved gun mounts and fire control systems. His complaints about periscope reliability led to engineering improvements. Every patrol report from Wahoo included technical feedback that the Navy submarine development bureaus used to improve future boats. Morton's influence on other submarine commanders was direct and personal. Officers who served with him on Wahoo went on to command their own boats, taking Morton's lessons with them. Richard O'Kane became the most decorated submarine commander of the war, sinking more confirmed tonnage than anyone else. O'Kane explicitly credited Morton with teaching him aggressive tactics, and when he took command of USS Tang, he modeled his leadership style on Morton's example. George Grider commanded USS Hawkbill and USS Flasher, successfully employing tactics he'd learned from Morton. Roger Payne served aboard multiple submarines, always advocating for Morton's aggressive approach. Through these disciples, Morton's tactical philosophy spread throughout the submarine force. But it wasn't just Wahoo veterans who were influenced. Commanders who'd never met Morton studied his patrol reports and adopted his methods. USS Silversides, USS Trigger, USS Harder, USS Barb, submarines across the Pacific Fleet began conducting more aggressive patrols, penetrating enemy harbors, attacking on the surface, and pressing home attacks at close range. The kill rate for American submarines increased dramatically in late 1943 and throughout 1944. Japanese shipping losses mounted to catastrophic levels. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was virtually destroyed.
Her economy was strangling, and her military was starving for supplies. American submarines achieved what the strategic bombing campaign against Germany struggled to accomplish. They completely severed the enemy's economic lifelines. The statistics are staggering. American submarines comprised less than 2% of the U.S. Navy, but were responsible for 55% of all Japanese shipping sunk during the war. They destroyed 1,314 enemy ships, totaling over 5 million tons, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. They also sank 201 Japanese submarines and naval vessels. The human cost was significant. 52 American submarines were lost, with 3,505 crew members killed, giving the submarine force the highest casualty rate of any American military branch at 22%. But the strategic impact was decisive. Japan was an island nation, completely dependent on imported raw materials, food, and fuel. American submarines cut those supply lines with devastating effectiveness. Morton's tactical legacy lived on in other ways, too. His innovation of separating command responsibilities, having the executive officer handle the periscope while the captain commanded, became standard practice throughout the submarine force and remains doctrine in modern submarines today. His emphasis on aggressive training and constant drilling influenced submarine training programs at New London, Connecticut, where submarine school instructors taught Morton's methods to new officers and crews. His understanding that morale and crew confidence were weapons as important as torpedoes influenced how the Navy approached submarine crew selection, training, and retention. The controversy surrounding some of Morton's actions, particularly the machine gunning of survivors from the Japanese troop ship, deserves examination. This incident occurred during Wahoo's third patrol and has been debated by historians and ethicists for decades. Morton's defenders argued that the survivors were enemy soldiers who would have simply reinforced Japanese garrisons on New Guinea, where they would have killed American troops. They point out that in the brutal, total war of the Pacific, where both sides frequently gave no quarter, Morton was making a tactical decision to prevent enemy combatants from returning to battle. His critics counter that firing on survivors in the water, even military survivors, violated the laws of war and basic humanity. They argued that Morton crossed an ethical line that should never be crossed, regardless of military justification.
The truth is complex and uncomfortable. The Pacific War was characterized by extreme brutality on both sides. Japanese forces routinely executed prisoners, massacred civilians, and fought to the death rather than surrender. American forces responded with their own brutality, taking few prisoners and adopting a kill-or-be-killed mentality. Morton's action must be understood in this context, not excused but understood. He was fighting a war where mercy was rare and the enemy showed none. Whether his decision was legally justified remains debatable. What's clear is that Morton believed he was making a legitimate military decision to protect American lives, and his superiors never questioned or punished his actions, suggesting that within the context of Pacific War naval operations, his decision fell within accepted norms of the time, however troubling that might be by modern standards. The final patrol of Wahoo haunts submarine historians. Why did Morton volunteer for such a dangerous mission? He'd already accomplished more than anyone expected. He could have accepted a safer assignment, rotated to shore duty, trained new commanders, and lived to see the war's end. But that wasn't Morton's nature. He was a warrior who needed combat, a hunter who needed the hunt. The challenge of penetrating the Sea of Japan was irresistible to him. It represented the ultimate test of his skills and his boat's capabilities. Some historians speculate that Morton had a death wish, that he'd survived so many close calls that he'd become reckless. Others argue he was simply confident in his abilities and unlucky that final time. We'll never know what was in Morton's mind as Wahoo slipped beneath the waves of La Perouse Strait for the last time. What we do know is that Morton's final patrol was successful before disaster struck. Japanese records indicate that Wahoo sank at least 3 ships inside the Sea of Japan before attempting to exit. True to form, Morton had penetrated the enemy's most protected waters and wreaked havoc. He'd proven it could be done. That several other American submarines successfully operated in the Sea of Japan later in the war was possible because Morton showed the way, even though he paid the ultimate price for his pioneering effort. The discovery of Wahoo's wreck in 2006 brought closure to families who'd waited over 60 years for confirmation of what happened to their loved ones. The wreck site has been designated a war grave, protected under international law. No salvage or disturbance is permitted. Wahoo lies where she fell, a monument to courage and sacrifice. Occasional memorial services are held by submarine veterans organizations with flowers dropped into the sea above Wahoo's resting place. These ceremonies honor not just the 80 men who died aboard Wahoo, but all submariners who served in the silent service, who fought a secret war beneath the waves, where heroism often went unrecognized and deaths went unrecorded. In the years since World War II, Morton and Wahoo have achieved legendary status within the submarine community. Every submarine officer learns about Morton at some point in their training. His tactics are analyzed in case studies. His leadership is held up as a model. The modern nuclear submarine force, with its sophisticated technology and global reach, traces its spiritual lineage directly back to commanders like Morton, who proved what submarines could accomplish. The aggressive, offensive mindset that characterizes American submarine doctrine today was born in the cramped control room of USS Wahoo, as Mush Morton revolutionized how submarines fight. The legacy of USS Wahoo extends beyond military history into the realm of leadership studies. Business schools teach case studies about Morton's management style. Leadership seminars use his example to illustrate how trust, clear communication, and leading from the front can transform organizational performance. Sports coaches study his methods for building team cohesion and competitive aggression. Morton's impact reaches far beyond the submarine force, influencing how we think about leadership, courage, and excellence under pressure. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to Morton and Wahoo comes from the men who served in submarines during World War II. At submarine veterans conventions, when the ceremony of talling the boats, reading the names of all 52 submarines lost during the war, a special silence falls when Wahoo's name is called. Veterans stand a little straighter. Tears form in weathered eyes, because they know that Wahoo wasn't just another lost boat. She was the submarine that showed them how to win, that gave them the courage to attack when wisdom counseled retreat, that proved Americans could master this deadly form of warfare and use it to crush the enemy.
The USS Wahoo changed the war by changing the warriors who fought it. She demonstrated that courage, combined with skill, could overcome superior enemy forces. She proved that aggressive leadership inspired greatness in ordinary men. She showed that innovation and unconventional thinking could revolutionize combat effectiveness. And she reminded everyone that freedom isn't free, that victory requires sacrifice, that some heroes die young, and that we must never forget the price paid by those who went into harm's way so that others might live in peace. Today, somewhere beneath the cold waters of La Perouse Strait, the USS Wahoo continues her eternal patrol. The boat is silent now, her engines cold, her crew forever at their posts. But her legacy lives on in every submarine that slides beneath the waves, in every commander who chooses aggression over caution, in every sailor who volunteers for submarine duty, knowing the risks but accepting them anyway. Mush Morton and his crew of 80 brave men changed naval warfare forever. They hunted the enemy without fear, fought with skill and determination, and gave everything for their country. Their story deserves to be remembered, studied, and honored for as long as submarines sail the oceans and nations need warriors willing to descend into darkness to defend the light. The submarine that changed the war was more than steel and machinery. She was the embodiment of American determination, the product of brilliant leadership, and the instrument of decisive victory. USS Wahoo and her legendary commander Mush Morton proved that wars are won not just by numbers and technology, but by courage, innovation, and the unbreakable spirit of men who refuse to quit. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was in 1943, and it will endure as long as free people must defend themselves against those who would destroy freedom. The story of USS Wahoo is ultimately a story about what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept limitations, when they dare greatly, and when they're willing to pay any price to achieve victory. It's a story that deserves to be told and retold, generation after generation, so that we never forget what real courage looks like and what it costs.